welcome back to part 2 of the tutorial. Right now, to finish up, we're going to be going over the shot here with some 3D tracked web as well as the reaction with my finger. And firstly, we're going to be covering this shot here where the web splats on the door. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you're going to want to do is create a new solid. I'm going to call this element 3D. I'm going to add element to it and go to the scene setup. Just as we did before, we're going to create a new cylinder. We're going to rotate it 90 degrees. I'm going to make its radius to the same radius as the last one we created in part 1, which was 0.035. And then the height, I'm going to go up to about 10. Doesn't need to be as long as the last one. And again, we're going to move it all the way to the right so it's off center. And then click this button here to change its anchor point. All right, and click OK. The next step is to create a new camera. 50mm is what I was shooting on if you're using my footage. Then we need to use these tools up here to reposition the camera so it appears as though the web is oriented as if it's coming from off screen and shooting at the door. So go ahead and you can watch and follow along to what I'm doing roughly. But I recommend just doing this to your own eye rather than trying to copy exactly because I'm not using any precise values. That looks about good to me. Now, the next step, if you're using my footage, I'm just going to say this briefly, is after the pan finishes, the door actually is not perfectly stable because I bumped my tripod a little bit. So if you look really closely, there is a small shake. So in order to get that out, what you need to do is click your footage and hit Control-Shift-D to split it right there, and then right-click on the second half and choose Freeze Frame. And that's just going to get rid of the movement. I'm going to pre-compose these and call it base footage. Again, obviously that was only relevant if you're using my footage. Don't forget to save. Moving on. Next, what we need to do is animate the web so it appears as if it's flying on from off screen. So we need to go just to the frame before it pans away, right there. Then we need to click the camera, hit P on the keyboard, and also Shift R on the keyboard, and create a keyframe for both the position and the orientation at that point. Next, move backwards a few frames, and then we need to reposition the camera so that way the web is going perfectly horizontal across the frame and does not have this fall off. So let's move it back center. Let's rotate it that direction. There we go, that looks good to me. Next, we need to animate the web to move on from the left to the right hand side of the screen. So the way to do that is to go to Element, go to the Group 1 settings, go to the particle look, and then go to particle size X, Y, and Z. We're going to be affecting the particle X size. So let's go to the same frame that we created our first keyframe of the camera at and click the stopwatch for X size. We're going to change it down to 0. Next, we need to move forward to the last frame of the animation and change the particle X size up to 1. And if you play that back, it's pretty good. All right, now that we have that taken care of, the next step on the agenda is to create the funnel-shaped looking web here. We're going to go to the scene setup, and this is actually quite the process. It's going to take a little while to do this. So go ahead and try and follow along as best as you can. And again, this whole section is up to your own personal preference. I'm going to show you how I did it. However, it's completely up to your own interpretation. I'm going to duplicate the cylinder model. And then I'm going to turn off the top one. I'm actually going to rename. And I'm going to call this main web. Just so I don't get that confused with anything else. So now I'm actually going to shorten up this one down to, say, 2.5, somewhere around there. Move it back center. Next, I'm going to duplicate this 3 times, Control D. Now there are 4 different copies. For each copy, I'm going to move it roughly the same distance in a different direction than each other. So the top one's going to go down, next one's going to go up, right, and then left. We get that. Next, I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to call this web array. Select all 4 of these by holding down Shift and move it into this group. It's important to note that the group that I just created is inside of the entire group folder. Make sure that you didn't accidentally create one that's outside on its own. Next, we're going to duplicate the entire group array by selecting the folder and hitting Control-D. You can just close that so it doesn't look so messy. And then we're going to rotate it just so it fills in the gaps. Then, believe it or not, we're going to do it one more time. Rotate it all the way around. Next, if you want, you can go through and just try and change some of these yourself by making it a little bit more random. Again, it's entirely up to your personal preference. Just do it in the way that you think looks best yourself. The other thing you could do is go through some of these and change their radius to be a little thinner. Some of them may be a little thicker. Don't get too crazy with it, as you don't want it to look super unrealistic. However, it is important to get some variation in there. The web is supposed to look messy and random. The next step is to add a bunch of cross-looking slings in here, and I'll show you how I did that. Make sure you have the group folder selected, and then we're going to create a new tube. The tube internal radius is going to be up towards about 90% or so. Again, it's up to your preference. Change the sides up quite a bit. That's important. We're going to change its height down almost all the way. Somewhere around maybe 0.035, maybe to match the thickness of the other web. Going to rotate it 90 degrees, move it out. I'm actually going to scale this down some. And we don't want it to be perfectly up and down, so I'm going to rotate this just a little bit. And that one is going to then be duplicated, moved forward, scaled down even more, and then duplicated one more time. And make sure to give these each their own little offset rotation. You don't want them to all look super uniform. Again, this is about making the web look messy. Another small thing that you could do is to not make them perfect circles. So maybe this one's going to be a little bit oblong. This one's going to be a little wide, and then this one a little bit oblong as well, we'll say. There we go. Now the tubes are just going to be used for the circular pattern at the base of the web. As it stretches out towards these tips, there's not going to be perfect rings. It's going to be more made up of line segments connecting to different pieces of the array. So I'm going to show you how to create one of those, and then I'm going to fast forward through creating the rest of them. So to do that, we just need to create a new cylinder, make its radius 0.035, turn its height segments up a lot. Doesn't have to be 200, just make sure they're up. And then we're going to change its height down a bit. Move this out, and I'm going to pick 2 random ones to connect. How about this one and this one here? I'm going to move it up, move it over. Gonna rotate this about like that. I'm gonna move its anchor point over and down just so it's easier for me to line this up. So we can rotate this down, push this closer to the base, move its height down some as well. And there we go. There is a small little segment connecting 2 of these. And so now the important thing to do is to go through and just pick a bunch of random ones to all connect throughout. So maybe this one to this one, this one to this one, this one to this one, and so on and so forth. I'm going to fast forward through doing this. And just like before, make sure all of them have a little bit different thicknesses, so that way it's not just perfectly uniform throughout. All right, that looks about good to me. Again, you can be as detailed as you like here, but I'm gonna call it good just for the sake of the tutorial and move on. So what we're gonna do is select the group folder, create a new group. You can double click or right click and rename, and I'm gonna call this web cylinder. I'm going to select everything except for the main web, again holding down Shift to do this, and drag it into the web cylinder folder. So now, if you close that, it's all together in one nice clean place. We can turn back on the main web, move this out to the front where it needs to be, and we can continue working from there. Alright, so there is actually one more step that I'm going to do to make this look a little bit more realistic and blend in with the main web. I'm going to create a new cylinder just like that. Make sure it's outside of the web cylinder group, but still inside of the main group folder. We're going to change its height segments again up a lot, its radius down to about 0.03, and then I'm going to rotate it and move it up. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is creating some long strands going from a little bit further up the main web into the web cylinder that we've created. It just kind of helps blend the two shapes together. Alright, that looks good to me, so we can go ahead and click OK and go back into After Effects. The next thing that we need to do is in the particle look rollout, go down to Deform, enable that if it's not already, find Noise, enable that as well. And then we're going to turn the intensity up to maybe about 0.8, and then the scale up to about maybe 800. That looks pretty good. And just like in part 1, I'm kind of pushing through this quickly for the sake of the tutorial. Some of this needs to be refined a little bit further, such as I don't like that we can see this ring perfectly. This strand's a little bit thick, as well as this one below it. Little things like that I'm going to leave alone for now. However, it's up to you guys for whatever you think looks good for your project. Now, the next thing to do before refining our animation a little bit more is blend this with our scene. We're going to go to Project, and I'm going to click on the environment map composition that we created in part 1 that has a little bit warmer tones than the original image, and drag that into my composition. Going to turn off visibility, go back to Element 3D, find the Custom Layers rollout and Custom Texture Maps. Under Layer 1, select that composition. Then we can go back into the scene setup, find Environment, and change it to Custom Layer 1 and click OK. Next, we need to go to the Materials and under Physical, assign Glass to the entire group. And then lastly, what we need to do is create a plane, which is going to appear back here in the center. We need to rotate this plane 90 degrees and push it out to the front of our web cylinder. Scale it up to maybe about 15 by 15 and make sure that it's intersecting with all of the legs at their highest point. So right about there looks good to me. Then under the physical materials as well, we need to apply a matte shadow to this. Click OK. Next, under the render settings, go to ambient occlusion, turn that on, and then turn the intensity down, maybe to about 1.5. Next, just like in part 1 again, we need to go to the physical environment, check show background. Under rotate environment, we need to rotate the environment until just the wall and the door, which we're actually compositing on, are in the background. That looks about good to me. So now we can turn off show background. And I'm actually going to make a quick adjustment to this composition. This door does not need to be quite so yellow, so maybe we can turn down the red and then up the blue just a hair and then lighten everything overall. There we go, that looks about good to me. Next, we need to add a new light to the scene. As you can tell by the door, as well as this doorknob especially, there is a slight soft shadow coming from the bottom right of the doorknob, so we need to add that coming from our web as well. Now the way to do that is to go Layer, New, Light, make sure it is a spotlight. The intensity and angle and feather all can be adjusted later. For now, just click OK. Now we need to point our light at our web and move it up and to the left in the direction the light realistically would have been coming from to create this shadow. And to further see what it's doing, we can go back to Element 3D and under the render settings, open up Shadows and click Enable. You can see the shadow that is being created right now is casting to the bottom left, meaning our light is not coming from the correct direction. The way to further refine that is to change one view to 4, so that way you can see the top, front, and right sides of our 3D space. and then change with some of these camera tools what you're focusing on, so that way you can further see the direction the light really is coming from. And the active camera there you can see is up in the top right, so you can further see what you're doing to this web. There we go, that looks pretty good. We can go back to one view. And this is the shadow we have created for ourselves. It obviously needs a little bit of refining, so we can go back to the light settings. Let's turn the intensity down to maybe about 70. Let's drop the angle to maybe about 90. And then let's feather it a lot. Our shadow darkness needs to be turned down a little bit as well. And the diffusion up. One other thing I like to do is change the shadow map size from 1024 to 2048. I think it just helps increase accuracy of the shapes that are projected. There we go, that looks pretty good to me. So before we begin compositing this to match our scene even further, we're going to finish up the animation. The first step to that is to go back to the scene setup in Element 3D. And now that I'm thinking about it, let's add all of these stretched cylinder models into our web cylinder folder. So we're just gonna hold Shift, select all of them, drag them in, and call that good. The web cylinder folder we need to animate to kind of open up as if it's getting ready to attach to the wall. The way to do that is to animate its scale. So we need to go down, make sure web cylinder is selected, to the auxiliary animation, and then choose channel 1. Then we can click OK. Now under group 1, find auxiliary channels, channel 1, and then the channel 1 scale. Go ahead and click your camera and hit U on the keyboard to bring up the keyframes that we have created for it. Now select element again, and at the last keyframe of the camera, select the stopwatch for scale. And then let's move forward a few frames and set the scale down to about 0.3. By the way, I went ahead and turned on motion blur for the composition and our Element 3D layer. Just so it'll render a little quicker, I'm going to turn that back off, but it will need to be turned back on later. So the next step to this animation process is to add the puppet tool finally. So what we're gonna do is select Element 3D and the camera and pre-compose them, move everything to a new comp, and I'm going to call this Web Splat. Okay, here in this new composition, we need to go to the final frame of the movement, which is right here. Select the puppet tool, and then on the ends of each one of these prongs, add a point. What this is going to do is stop these points from moving around while animating the rest of this web, because realistically they wouldn't be sliding around on the door. Next, we need to create a point for the very base of this web cylinder, and then also one for the very end of the web. Now, if you look really closely, you can see this strange halo. Maybe not in the YouTube compression, but trust me, it's there. The way to fix it, if you're seeing it yourself, is to go down here in the timeline and open up Mesh 1 and change the expansion up very high, and also the number of triangles that you're working with needs to go up as well, and that should have fixed the problem. Now moving forward with the animation, go ahead and select Web Splat and hit U on the keyboard to open up the keyframe information for each one of our puppet tool pins that we have created. Now let's move this one at this point forward just a touch, but be careful not to move it so much that the web itself is creating this arc. It needs to be moved forward in a very straight manner. Now let's move forward 2 frames, stretch it out, and then 1 more frame and bring it back into the middle of those 2 keyframes. I'm going to expand this last keyframe actually out 2 frames as well instead. Then we need to select the middle keyframe, right click, keyframe assistant, Easy Ease. And so now this has this web compress and stretch animation to it. Now on the last frame of this movement right here, we need to go to this keyframe at the very base, and let's move forward 2 frames and move it up just a touch. 2 more frames, move it back down. 2 more frames back up, but a little bit less this time. And I'll zoom in so you can see better. 2 more frames back down, 1 more frame back up, and then 1 more frame back to the middle. And if you play this back, you get this vibrating animation. Now that I look at it, this web compress is a little bit too drastic, so I'm going to lower the amount that it is coming out. There we go, that looks about good. So to finish up this shot, there's just a couple more compositing steps that need to be done. However, I'm going to add that the animation we just created is rushed a little bit for the sake of explaining it in the tutorial. It would need to be refined just a little bit further, so go ahead and experiment on your own and decide what you think looks best. Alright, so to finish up, what we need to do is go to our web splat composition, and under the render settings, select motion blur and set the samples from 6 to 15. I think that just looks pretty good to blend the motion blur realistically with the scene. Next, make sure motion blur is turned on for the composition and the layer. And finally, I noticed the ambient occlusion was a little strong, so I'm going to turn it from 1.5 down to 1. Next, back in this composition here, I'm going to go to a frame where I can clearly see the web splat on the door. And I'm going to add a brightness and contrast effect, and I'm going to turn the brightness up to maybe about 6 and also the contrast up to about 4. I'm noticing it's looking a little warm. The web should look more white than this beige color, so I'm going to add a color balance effect and pull out the red and the greens from the midtones. Alright, and those are all the fundamentals for creating this web splat shot. The original had a little bit smaller prongs coming out, as well as more noise to the actual web cylinder. Just to show you guys, this is the way I set up the original. It's actually in its own group folder, but that required a lot more steps in the animation process, so I simplified it for the tutorial. However, just to show you guys, it was set up in group 2, which allowed for it to have a lot heavier noise on it compared to when it was set up in its own group, like the way we did it. If you have any further questions about setting up this shot, please let me know in the comments and I will get to you as soon as I can. With that being said, moving on to our final effect. Now that you know the trick we used with the puppet tool, this final effect is actually very simple. Select all the footage and pre-compose it. Then what we need to do is 3D camera track the shot. So go to the tracker and click track camera. Once it's finished, all you need to do is create camera. Then we're going to create a new solid of element 3D. In the scene setup, just as we did before, we're going to create a new cylinder. Rotate it 90 degrees, set its radius down to about 0.035, its height up to about 30 this time, and then its segments all the way up to about 200. We're going to add our glass texture onto it, and then click OK. Next, we need to go to the project, find our environment map, drag it into the composition. We need to freeze frame it, so that way it lasts for the entirety of the composition. Turn it off. In element 3D, we need to go to the custom layers, custom texture maps, and set the custom layer 1 to our environment. Back in the scene setup, click environment, select custom layer 1, click OK, and then click OK again. Now all we need to do is line up the web so it matches the perspective that it would be coming out of the little web shooter I created here and extending out past the edge of the frame. What you'll need to do is select your footage, select 3D camera tracker, find one of these points on this web shooter, and then right click and create null. Then what you'll need to do is select the null, hit P on the keyboard, select the element 3D layer. Under group 1, click create group null. Select P on that group null, copy the position that we created from the null that we got from our camera tracker, and paste it onto our null that controls our object. There we go, it's all lined up and it's tracked correctly. However, it does not extend all the way to the outside of the frame, so what we'll need to do is go back into the scene setup and change our height from 30 to about 60 maybe. Click OK. We need to go back to our object and drag it along its x-axis so it's lined up how it should be. There we go, looks good. Next, we need to select element 3D, go into the particle look for group 1, open up deform, enable it, open up noise, enable that, change the intensity to about 0.35, the scale up to about 800. Next, we need to turn on the depth of field for our camera, and then set the aperture to about 50, and the blur level to about 160, and then the focal point up to about 10,000. Next, select Element 3D, the camera, and all the nulls. Pre-compose this. Go into our pre-composed comp. Turn on motion blur for Element 3D and the composition. Next, we need to take that clip that we had of my finger rotoscoped out that we created earlier and put that on top of the web. If you haven't done it already, it's as simple as duplicating the footage composition, putting one of the copies above the web, and then just cutting out the finger for the frames that it's needed. Now there are only 2 more things to be done. Select the web. I'm going to add a color balance adjustment to it. Add some reds in the midtones to about 10, and then take out the same amount in blue. Add a curves adjustment. Darken it down just a touch. Next, with our web comp selected, let's go forward to the frame just as the finger would be plucking the web. That looks good to me. Select the puppet tool. Create a point at the base, a point where the finger would be touching, and then a point at the very end. We're going to move forward 2 frames. Drag the finger pluck point down a touch. 2 more frames, up just a little bit. 2 more frames, down just a little bit. 1 more frame up, and then 1 more frame back into the middle. You need to go to the mesh and make sure the expansion is up as well as the triangles so you don't get that weird artifacting. Alright, and that's the animation we have created. Alright, that concludes the Spider-Man web effect tutorial. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something. Sorry this one was so long, I just didn't want to leave out any of the details that went into creating the original. Feel free to ask any question you may have in the comments, or let me know if there's something that needs clarification, and I will do my best to answer that for you. Don't forget to like this video if you learned something, and consider subscribing for more tutorials.